Emily Rhodess was just another passenger on Flight 227 bound for Denver. At 35 years old, she blended into the crowd as she made her way through Dallas-Fort Worth International Airport, an unremarkable figure with her economy-class ticket in hand and a carry-on bag slung over her shoulder. Her plain appearance, dressed in casual clothes like everyone else, didn't reveal the depth of her past. In a world where people were quick to judge based on appearances, no one would guess that she had once commanded tactical airlift squadrons, flying C-130s into hostile territory. The only clue to her hidden past was the quiet, confident way she moved through the airport, a reminder of the intense discipline and skill she had honed as a military pilot. Yet, despite all her accomplishments, today, Emily was just another civilian, sitting quietly on a commercial flight. As she boarded the Boeing 737, Emily couldn't help but notice the subtle signs that something was off. The left engine made a slight, almost imperceptible vibration during the startup sequence, something only someone who had spent hours in the cockpit would notice. To most passengers, it was just the usual noise of a plane preparing for takeoff. But Emily had a trained ear. She had flown through turbulent skies, through combat zones, and had developed an instinct for noticing when things weren't quite right. It wasn't just the mechanical sounds, though. She also sensed an unease in the cabin, an almost nervous energy that seemed to pulse beneath the surface. The captain's hurried pre-flight announcement and the way he stumbled over his words only added to the growing sense of discomfort. Despite her instincts telling her something wasn't quite right, Emily remained in her seat, not wanting to raise suspicion. She knew that questioning the flight crew or trying to intervene would make her seem like one of those so-called wannabe pilots, people who'd watched a few too many episodes of Top Gun and thought they could fly. Emily had faced that sort of judgment before. The businessman seated behind her chuckled under his breath as he spoke to his companion, making a joke about aviation groupies. The mockery stung, but she kept her thoughts to herself. She had learned the hard way that in civilian life, no one cared about your past experiences, no matter how extraordinary they were. To them, she was just another woman, nothing special. As the flight attendants made their rounds, Emily overheard part of a conversation between them. "Can you believe she wanted to tour the cockpit? Like it's a museum or something," one of the attendants whispered. The other one laughed, adding, "Maybe she thinks she's a pilot." It took everything Emily had not to turn around and set them straight, but she didn't. She understood. The world of commercial aviation was strict. Asking to speak with the flight crew was a breach of protocol, especially for someone who wasn't even in the industry. Still, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. When she had asked to speak with the flight crew earlier, it hadn't been out of curiosity. She wasn't there to gawk at the cockpit. She was there because she noticed something in the captain's demeanor that made her uneasy. The way his words slurred, the faint wobble in his voice, they were signs of something far more serious than simple fatigue. Emily closed her eyes, trying to ignore the faint buzz of her racing mind. She tried to focus on the familiar sounds of pre-flight preparations, the gentle hum of the air conditioning, the soft hydraulic whine as the control surfaces were tested. Yet, despite her best efforts to tune out the distractions, she couldn't let go of the growing sense of unease that had settled in her chest. She could feel the tension in the air, a quiet but persistent signal that something wasn't right. To anyone else, it might have seemed like ordinary pre-flight jitters. But Emily, with her thousands of hours in the air, knew better. Her mind flashed back to her days in the military. She had been trained to notice every small detail, to be hyper-aware of her surroundings. In her world, there was no room for mistakes. Her ability to sense danger before it fully revealed itself had saved countless lives, and yet here she was, a civilian, sitting quietly among a sea of people who had no idea who she really was. They had no way of knowing that she had once navigated the treacherous skies of hostile territory, that her reflexes and instincts had been honed in situations where failure meant death. As the plane began its taxi toward the runway, Emily tried to calm herself. The acceleration as the 737's engines spooled up to takeoff power felt almost familiar, but something still nagged at her. The angle of the plane's ascent felt steeper than usual, more aggressive than standard procedure called for. A sense of foreboding crept over her. She tried to ignore it, to convince herself that it was nothing more than the paranoia of someone who hadn't been in the cockpit for 2 years. But as the plane gathered speed on the runway, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was about to go terribly wrong. Despite all of her training, Emily found herself stuck in a situation she couldn't control. She was just a passenger on this flight, and yet her instincts screamed at her to take action. But she didn't. Not yet. She had learned to trust her training, to understand that some battles were meant to be fought in the quiet moments, not in the chaos that often followed. But, as the plane lifted off the ground and she felt a slight shift in its motion, Emily couldn't help but wonder if today, her instincts were right. There was no doubt in her mind that something was wrong. She just hoped she was wrong about it. Emily sat quietly in her seat, observing the usual pre-flight routine as the plane taxied down the runway. To the untrained eye, everything appeared normal. But to Emily, who had spent years in the cockpit, every detail mattered. The slight vibration of the left engine during startup, the way the captain's voice faltered as he made the pre-flight announcement. These were not the signs of a well-rested, confident pilot. She could hear it in his voice, the tension in the words, the way his sentences stretched just a bit longer than they should have. It wasn't something any of the passengers would notice, but Emily had been trained to catch the smallest signs of distress. Something was off, and her instincts told her this flight might not be as routine as it seemed. Captain Mitchell, despite his vast experience, appeared to be struggling. Emily watched him closely, noticing the way his hands trembled slightly as he adjusted the flight controls. He was a veteran, with over 20,000 flight hours, but there was something in his eyes of fatigue that no one had spoken about. The captain wiped his brow, his movements slow and deliberate, as if trying to mask his discomfort. Emily knew that fatigue could affect a pilot's reaction times, but there was more to this. The subtle signs of something deeper were there, the slight disorientation in his speech, the dullness in his eyes. She couldn't help but feel a sinking sensation in her stomach. Beside him, First Officer Mike Torres was noticeably on edge. Emily watched as he kept glancing over at Mitchell, his gaze betraying his concern. It wasn't just the usual pre-flight nervousness. Torres was visibly uncomfortable. He kept adjusting his headset, tapping the edge of it repeatedly, as though trying to calm his own rising anxiety. Emily could see the tension between them, the unspoken worry that neither of them wanted to address out loud. She had worked with flight crews before, and it was clear that something wasn't right with either of them. While she had no intention of overstepping, her instincts screamed that the crew wasn't fully prepared for this flight. As the plane climbed to cruising altitude, Emily continued to watch the cockpit door, unable to shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. She noticed the flight attendants moving around the cabin, their bright smiles masking their unease. Emily overheard one of them talking to her colleague about a recent request. Someone had asked to tour the cockpit before takeoff. "Can you believe it?" the flight attendant had whispered. "This isn't a museum." Emily didn't respond, but she couldn't help but feel the sting of their mockery. They had no idea who she really was, what she was capable of. To them, she was just another passenger, no different from the others who didn't know the first thing about flying. Her mind raced back to her days as a military pilot. She had been in situations far more dangerous, flying missions that required not just skill but the ability to read people, to gauge every situation before it spiraled out of control. In the military, the stakes were always high, and her training had taught her how to recognize when things went wrong before. They escalated. Today, however, she was grounded, a civilian among civilians, watching as a potentially dangerous situation unfolded before her. She had trained herself to stay calm under pressure. But now, as a passenger, she was helpless, or so she thought. Her attention shifted to the cockpit again. The captain's voice crackled through the intercom, announcing that they were about to take off. Mitchell sounded strained, the usual confidence absent from his words. Emily felt her heart rate pick up, not because she was afraid, but because her gut was telling her something wasn't right. The acceleration of the plane as it moved down the runway was normal at first, but then something changed. The angle of takeoff seemed sharper, more aggressive than usual, and it caught Emily's attention immediately. Her instincts, honed over years of flying in combat zones, told her that the situation was deteriorating fast. She gripped the armrest, willing herself to stay calm. Mitchell's strained voice over the intercom confirmed her worst fears. There was a subtle slur in his words, a hesitation that might have seemed insignificant to the untrained ear but was unmistakable to Emily. Something was wrong. She had seen this before pilots pushing through fatigue, ignoring their body's signals, until it was too late. She had seen it in her own squadron, where pride often prevented people from acknowledging their limitations. But this wasn't her squadron. This wasn't military protocol. This was a commercial flight, and the stakes were much higher. The feeling in Emily's stomach twisted into something deeper as the plane began to climb. The usual rise in altitude felt wrong. The pitch of the plane seemed steeper than necessary, and the engine noise shifted in a way that didn't sit right. She had been trained to notice the smallest changes in sound, the slight changes in the way an aircraft responded to the pilot's commands. The more she listened, the more certain she became that the captain was struggling, that something was going seriously awry. It was at that moment that the sudden, gut-wrenching lurch of the plane signaled that things had gone from bad to worse. Emily's heart skipped a beat as the aircraft pitched downward unexpectedly. The passengers were thrown forward, their seatbelts digging into their bodies. A cold sweat broke out across Emily's forehead as the plane started to shake. This was no longer a normal flight. She couldn't stay passive any longer. She had to do something. But what could she do? She was just a passenger, after all. And yet, as the plane continued to shudder and descend, Emily knew that she was the only one on this plane who could do anything about it. Her hands tightened on the armrests, her mind racing through the emergency procedures she had once memorized. She had been trained for this, trained to act when others froze. But would anyone listen to her? Would anyone believe that she was more than just a regular passenger? The fear and uncertainty that filled the cabin was palpable, but Emily kept her focus sharp. She could feel her pulse quicken, but she was determined not to panic. She was a trained pilot, and in moments like this, training mattered more than anything else. Emily knew that she had to stay calm and take control of the situation. No matter how impossible it seemed, every instinct she had told her that time was running out. The plane was falling fast, and the crew was in no position to save them. She knew that if she didn't act, there was no telling what would happen next. And with that, the weight of her decision hung in the air. Would she stay seated and let fate take its course? Or would she rise and do what she had been trained to do, save the lives of everyone aboard the plane? Lurched violently, throwing passengers against their seatbelts. Emily's eyes snapped open, her heart racing. The smooth hum of the engines had turned into a terrifying scream, and the familiar pressure of ascent was replaced with a gut-wrenching descent. The cabin filled with panicked screams, the kind that only erupted when things had gone horribly wrong. The overhead bins rattled as bags shifted violently, and the plane bucked, fighting to stay in the air. Emily's pulse quickened as she watched the captain's body slump forward, his hands falling off the controls, leaving the plane to plummet. In the cockpit, chaos reigned. Captain Mitchell's body had collapsed against the control panel, pushing the aircraft into a dangerously steep dive. First Officer Torres was fumbling with the controls, his face pale with terror. He yanked at the yoke, trying desperately to level the aircraft, but his hands shook uncontrollably. Emily knew that he had no idea what to do. The situation was beyond anything he had been trained for. The plane was falling, and every second that passed brought them closer to the ground. In the cabin, the atmosphere was pure panic. People screamed, some crying, others frantically praying. The flight attendants struggled to maintain order, but their voices were drowned out by the terror rising around them. Emily could hear the urgent clatter of oxygen masks deploying, and the blaring warning system in the cockpit blared, "Terrain, terrain, pull up." The noise was deafening. As the plane descended, Emily's training kicked in. She knew what had to be done. She was the only one who could do anything to stop it. Without a second thought, Emily unbuckled her seatbelt. She had no time to waste. She had trained for moments like this, moments where the fate of the people around her rested on her ability to act. Quickly, as the flight attendants yelled at her to sit back down, Emily moved with purpose, pushing past them. Her mind was focused on the cockpit, and she could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on her shoulders. The businessman behind her, the one who had mocked her earlier, was now staring at her in disbelief. The words from the flight attendants were drowned in the noise of the aircraft's descent, but Emily's feet were already moving toward the cockpit door. The cabin shook again, and the passengers around her cried out in fear. Emily reached the cockpit, her hand resting on the door handle. She hesitated for a fraction of a second. Then, without another thought, she pushed the door open and stepped inside. Torres looked up at her, his face a mixture of confusion and fear. He opened his mouth to speak, but Emily didn't give him the chance. She assessed the situation in an instant. Mitchell was unconscious, his body slumped over the yoke, pushing the plane into a steeper dive. Torres was frozen, his hands trembling as he fought with the controls. The plane was falling fast, and every second counted. Emily didn't hesitate. She took control. Her hands moved quickly, pushing Torres aside with the practiced authority of someone who had spent years in the cockpit. She shoved the captain's limp body off the controls, her heart pounding as she slid into the captain's seat. The cold, familiar weight of the yoke was a comfort. She knew exactly what needed to be done. She had done it 100 times in combat zones, but never like this. The life of every person aboard rested on her ability to act now. "Torres, give me control," she commanded. her voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through her veins. Torres hesitated, staring at her in disbelief. He was lost, trapped in the same panic that had gripped the passengers in the cabin. But Emily's presence, her calm demeanor, had an effect on him. He nodded, stepping back, but not without a look of skepticism on his face. She could see that he didn't believe she could do this, that she wasn't just another passenger, but she didn't care. She didn't have time to explain. Emily quickly assessed the controls. The aircraft was in a steep dive, and the altimeter was rapidly descending. She pulled the power back, cutting the engine throttle to idle. "Cut the autopilot," she ordered. Torres complied, and Emily felt the plane respond to her commands. The violent shaking subsided as she gently pulled back on the yoke. Her eyes locked on the instruments, the world outside the cockpit blurring as she focused on the task at hand. The plane groaned, its systems straining, but it began to level out. She keyed the radio, her voice firm and clear, cutting through the chaos. "Dallas Tower, this is Flight 227. We have an incapacitated captain and are recovering from an emergency descent. Requesting immediate priority landing." There was a brief pause on the other end of the radio, and then the controller responded, their voice crackling with confusion. "Flight 227, who is speaking?" The question caught Emily off guard. "Falcon 1, she said, her voice unwavering. "I have control of the aircraft." A silence followed, and Emily could feel the weight of the moment in the stillness. The controller's voice returned, now filled with recognition. "Falcon 1. "Confirm you said Falcon 1. Emily nodded. Though Torres could not see her, he was still staring at her in disbelief, as if trying to process the reality of the situation. Emily's hand tightened on the yoke, her focus absolute. She had been in tight situations before, but nothing like this. The calm in her mind, the laser focus she had honed over years of military service, was now all that stood between 183 lives and disaster. The controller, now fully aware of who she was, responded, "Falcon 1, you have priority for any runway you want. Emergency vehicles are rolling." Emily took a deep breath. The plane was still descending, but the worst of it was over. Her grip on the controls tightened as she guided the aircraft into a more stable descent, the warning systems in the cockpit quieting down. For the first time since the chaos began, Emily felt a glimmer of control. The descent slowed, and the passengers in the cabin likely felt the shift. They might not have known who she was or what she had done to save them, but the plane was no longer falling. Torres, still shaken by the experience, looked at her with a mixture of awe and guilt. "You're military, aren't you?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper. Emily kept her eyes on the instruments. "Tactical airlift," she replied, her tone neutral. "Been out for 7 years." There was a brief silence as Torres processed the information. Emily could see the realization dawn on him. What happened? Why did you leave?" he asked, his voice barely audible. Emily's jaw tightened, but she didn't respond immediately. "Lost my entire crew on a routine extraction mission," she said quietly, the weight of the memory settling in her chest. She didn't need to say more. Torres understood. The descent continued, but now with purpose. Emily was back in control, and the plane began to stabilize. The crisis was far from over, but Emily had already taken the first crucial step toward saving everyone. Aboard, with steady hands and a calm heart, she piloted the aircraft through the storm, fully aware that she was the only one who could get them out alive. The cockpit was a blur of confusion when Emily stepped inside. First Officer Torres looked up at her with wide eyes, his face pale and full of panic. The plane was still losing altitude, the sudden dive throwing them off course. He was fumbling with the controls, his movements erratic, too frantic to be effective. Emily didn't waste a second. Her instincts, honed from years of military service, kicked in as she stepped into the captain's seat. Without a word, she took hold of the yoke and shoved Mitchell's lifeless body aside. Her fingers curled around the controls, the familiar weight of them grounding her in the chaos. In that moment, Emily became the calm in the storm. Torres stood frozen for a heartbeat, still processing what was happening. His disbelief was written all over his face. What are you doing?" he finally asked, his voice trembling. Emily didn't answer right away. She didn't need to. She focused on the instruments, her mind already calculating her next moves. She pulled the throttle back, cutting the power to idle. The plane groaned as the engines adjusted, and she felt the descent slow just slightly. But it was a start. Torres, still hovering at the door, watched her with growing awe, his hand trembling as he gripped the side of the cockpit. "Cut the autopilot," Emily ordered, her voice steady despite the wildness of the situation. Torres hesitated for a moment, but then, reluctantly, he complied. The autopilot switched off with a soft beep, and Emily now had full control of the aircraft. She could feel the weight of the plane in her hands as she gently pulled back on the yoke, guiding it away from the steep dive. The shaking started to subside as she fought the aircraft back to level flight. Torres was still watching her, but this time there was no confusion in his eyes. The realization hit him like a slap to the face. The woman standing before him wasn't just some passenger, she was a pilot, and a damn good one at that. Emily's mind raced, but she moved with the precision and control that came from years of experience. She knew the cockpit as well as she knew her own body. Every gauge, every warning light, every switch had a purpose. As she adjusted the flight path, she thought back to her time flying combat missions, when every decision mattered. There was no room for hesitation or fear then. And there was none now. Emily was in control, and she was going to keep it that way. She glanced at Torres, who was standing awkwardly by the door. He still looked like he was waiting for someone to tell him what to do. "Get on the radio," she said, her voice cutting through the noise in the cockpit. "Tell Dallas Tower we need a priority landing." Torres nodded quickly, but his hand shook as he reached for the radio. Emily kept her eyes on the instruments, adjusting the controls as the plane began to stabilize. Her heart was pounding, but her body remained steady, every move precise. This was what she had been trained for. "Dallas Tower, this is Flight 227. Torres finally spoke into the radio, his voice cracking slightly. "We've lost our captain. We need emergency assistance for a priority landing." There was a long pause before the controller responded. "Flight 227, who is speaking?" Torres glanced at Emily, his expression a mix of confusion and gratitude. Emily met his eyes for a brief second, her jaw set. She stepped forward and took the radio from him. "This is Falcon 1, she said, her voice firm. There was a brief moment of silence. Then the controller's voice crackled through. "Falcon 1. Confirm you said Falcon 1. The words hit like a thunderclap. Emily's call sign, the one she had earned after countless dangerous missions, the one that had once made her a legend in military circles, had been heard on the other end of the radio. She could feel the weight of that name now, the power it carried, and the responsibility that came with it. "Yes, Falcon 1, Emily confirmed, her voice unwavering. "I have control of the aircraft." There was a long pause, and then the controller spoke again, now with a new tone of respect. "Falcon 1, you have priority for any runway you want. Emergency vehicles are rolling." Emily didn't let herself feel the rush of pride or relief that might have come with the recognition. There was no time for that. There was only the task at hand, bringing this plane in for a safe landing. She turned to Torres, who was still staring at her, now with a look of complete respect in his eyes. "Get us a heading." "Torres," she said, "turn left, heading 180. I'll bring the plane down." His fingers flew over the controls as he set the new course, the plane responding almost immediately. Emily adjusted the yoke, guiding the aircraft onto the new path. The violent shaking had almost stopped, but there was still a lot of work ahead. They were still too high, too fast, but they were no longer falling. Emily's mind moved with the precision of a well-oiled machine. She had flown countless missions in her career, but none of them had ever been like this. The lives of everyone aboard rested on her ability to stay calm and execute every step perfectly. There was no room for mistakes, no second chances. As the aircraft began its approach toward Dallas, Emily focused entirely on the instruments, making small adjustments here and there. The landing gear came down, the flaps were deployed, and the runway was beginning to come into view. "How do you know how to do this?" Torres asked, his voice barely above a whisper. His awe was palpable, and Emily didn't need to look at him to know that he was still processing everything. She had just saved them. She had saved everyone aboard, and now she was bringing the plane in for a safe landing. "I've been trained for moments like this," Emily said quietly, her eyes fixed ahead. "And I'm not about to let all these people die today." Torres didn't say anything else, but Emily could see his expression change. He was no longer a panicked, overwhelmed first officer. He was now focused, his respect for her clear in every movement. They worked in silence, each one following the other's lead. As the plane continued its descent, Emily's heart pounded, but her hands remained steady. She had been in combat zones, in life-and-death situations, and this was no different. The calm she had cultivated in years of flying in some of the most dangerous conditions was now her greatest strength. The runway came into view. The flashing lights of emergency vehicles dotted the perimeter. Emily eased the plane lower, guiding it toward the tarmac. Every muscle in her body was tight with focus. This wasn't over yet. They were almost there, but she wasn't going to take any chances. As the plane approached the runway, she gave one final instruction to Torres. "Gear down," she said, her voice firm. The wheels of the plane touched the runway with a soft thud, and the screech of rubber on asphalt was music to Emily's ears. She had done it. They had done it. The plane came to a smooth stop, the emergency vehicles pulling up beside them. The passengers were safe. Emily's job was done. The plane touched down with a smoothness that belied the chaos they had just endured. Emily eased the yoke back, guiding the aircraft gently onto the runway. The sudden rush of emergency vehicles on the ground seemed distant, like a muffled echo to the sharp clarity of the cockpit. As the wheels met the tarmac, a wave of relief washed over her. The descent had been hard, the tension palpable, but now, for the first time in what felt like an eternity, the plane was stable. It was over. The passengers, still strapped in their seats, began to realize they were safe. They had survived. And it was Emily who had brought them home. Torres, who had been standing by her side for what seemed like an eternity, looked over at Emily in awe. His face, pale and strained throughout the descent, now showed signs of respect, admiration, and perhaps disbelief. As the aircraft taxied to a stop and the emergency lights flashed around them, he let out a breath he didn't know he had been holding. He had witnessed her control the aircraft with a confidence he had never expected from a passenger. He had no words for it, only a look of deep respect. Emily, however, wasn't interested in the praise. She didn't need the recognition. As the plane came to a full stop, the weight of the moment began to settle in. She had done what was necessary, not for glory, but because it was her duty just like any other mission she had ever flown. But now, she was done. She had completed her task. She removed her seatbelt and unbuckled her harness, preparing to leave the cockpit. It was time to step away from the chaos and return to a world that didn't understand the weight of what had just happened. She walked past Torres, who still stood there, his mouth slightly agape. She gave him a small nod as she passed, acknowledging his silent gratitude. But she didn't slow down. There were no speeches, no dramatic moments. She didn't need them. As she stepped out into the cabin, the silence was broken by the soft murmur of passengers slowly coming to terms with the situation. The tension in the air had shifted from fear to awe. The businessman who had mocked her earlier was standing, his face flushed with embarrassment. He caught her eye as she walked past, and without a word, he stepped aside, allowing her space. A few other passengers stood, some with hands pressed together in thanks, others just staring at her in stunned silence. There were no more jokes, no more whispers. The mockery had evaporated, replaced by a quiet reverence. "Ma'am, I owe you an apology," the businessman stammered, his voice shaky. What I said about flight simulators, I had no idea who you were." Emily didn't respond right away. She had heard that line before, from people who didn't understand. But there was no anger in her, no need to explain. She simply gave him a brief smile, a nod that acknowledged his apology without needing to say a word. "You couldn't have known," she said, her voice soft but steady. "It's all right. You don't need to apologize." Around her, the passengers were now whispering among themselves, recounting what had happened. Some were still in shock, others in awe. A few had tears in their eyes as they realized how close they had come to disaster. The flight attendants, who had once tried to stop her from entering the cockpit, were now watching her with newfound respect. Sarah, one of the attendants, approached her with a hesitant step, her eyes filled with gratitude. "I almost didn't let you in," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "If I had, we might not be here right now." Emily looked at her, her face unreadable, and then gave a small, reassuring smile. "You were just doing your job," she replied. "Following protocols is important. Today was just an exception." Sarah nodded, clearly torn between relief and the weight of what had happened. Emily could see the guilt in her eyes, but she wasn't about to let Sarah carry that burden. They had all done what they could in the moment. As Emily made her way down the aisle, a young girl reached out and tugged on her sleeve. Are you really a hero?" she asked, her wide eyes filled with wonder. Emily knelt down to the child's level, her expression softening. "Heroes are just people who do what needs to be done," she said gently. "Today, that happened to be me. Tomorrow, it could be someone else." The mother, who had been standing nearby, placed a hand on Emily's shoulder. "Thank you for bringing my daughter home safely," she said quietly, her voice full of sincerity. Emily's chest tightened at the simple words. They weren't the grandiose thanks she had expected or wanted. But there was something more genuine in them, something that touched her more deeply than any applause ever could. She had brought 183 people home safely. That was enough. By the time she reached the door of the plane, the passengers had begun to deplane. The emergency medical technicians boarded to tend to Captain Mitchell, and the flight attendants helped passengers gather their belongings. Emily stepped aside, allowing them to pass. But she didn't look back. She didn't need to. As she walked down the gangway, she overheard snippets of conversation. Some passengers were asking about her military service. Others were still trying to piece together the unbelievable story of how a civilian had taken control of the aircraft and saved their lives. She could hear Torres speaking to one of the paramedics, his voice shaky as he explained everything that had happened. She just took control, he said. We would have all been gone if it wasn't for her. Emily didn't stop to listen. She didn't want to hear it. She wasn't in this for recognition. She had done what was necessary, and now it was time to return to her life, a life that had been waiting for her all. This time, she had moved on from the past, from the guilt, from the memories of missions that had gone wrong. Today, she had proven to herself that she was still capable, that the training had never left her. But tomorrow, she would go back to being just another civilian, another face in the crowd. That was all she wanted. As she reached the terminal, the sound of her boots echoed on the floor, and the bustle of the airport seemed to return to normal around her. No one knew who she was, and that was exactly how she liked it. She didn't need the spotlight. All she needed was the peace of knowing that when the moment came, she had been the one to act. It was over. The plane had landed. The passengers were safe. And Emily had once again proved that heroes don't need recognition to do what's right. After the events of Flight 227, Emily's life returned to a semblance of normalcy, but nothing would ever be the same. She went back to her role as a flight instructor, passing on the skills and wisdom she had gained throughout her years of service. Her experience had forever shaped her, and now she shared those lessons with young pilots, teaching them not just how to fly, but how to be ready when the unexpected happened. She became a quiet legend, one who did not seek the spotlight but somehow found herself in it nonetheless. At aviation safety conferences, she began to speak about her experience, about the courage it took to act in the face of terror, and how sometimes heroism isn't something you plan for, it's something that happens when you're prepared to do what needs to be done. Emily never sought recognition for what she had done, but she found herself receiving it in ways she hadn't expected. Her story from Flight 227 spread through the aviation world. Passengers from the flight spoke of the woman who had taken control when no one else could, and soon. She was being invited to share her experience at conferences and seminars. She spoke of the calm under pressure, of the instinct to act when it mattered most. But above all, she spoke of the importance of training, of preparation, and of never underestimating anyone based on their appearance or position. Her message resonated deeply, especially in an industry where authority was often defined by uniforms and titles. Emily showed that sometimes true heroes don't wear capes or uniforms. They simply act when the world needs them most. As she continued to speak, her respect within the aviation community grew. But Emily remained the same quiet, humble person she had always been. She didn't look for accolades or fame. She found fulfillment in doing her job, in teaching others, and in the quiet recognition that her actions had saved so many lives. Her role as an instructor brought a sense of peace to her. She no longer carried the weight of the past in the same way. By teaching others, she helped shape the next generation of pilots, instilling in them not only technical skill but also the sense of responsibility and calm that had carried her through the crisis on Flight 227. And yet, as she stood in front of her students, sharing the lessons learned from years of service, she didn't speak much about that day. It was part of her past, a chapter that was closed, though it had shaped her in ways she couldn't explain. She knew that some of her students looked up to her as a hero, but she never saw herself that way. In her eyes, she was just someone who did what had to be done. The real heroes were those who had to make the hardest choices, those who never made it home. Months passed, and Emily found herself back in the cockpit of a C-130, flying for the military once again. She had returned to active duty, not out of necessity, but because it was where she belonged. The Pentagon had reached out to her, recognizing her talents and leadership, and offered her a chance to train new pilots in tactical airlift missions. The job felt like coming home. The control, the precision, the weight of responsibility, it was all so familiar. The scars from past missions were still there, but now they were part of the story, not the entirety of it. As she prepared for her first flight back in uniform, Emily reflected on how far she had come. She had once believed that her time in the cockpit was over, that her days of flying were behind her. But here she was, ready to teach others, ready to lead once more. The world hadn't ended after Flight 227. It had simply changed, and Emily had changed with it. But one thing remained the same: her commitment to doing what needed to be done. She would never ask for permission to act. She would simply rise to the occasion when it came. Back in the civilian world, the aviation industry had begun to shift. The lessons learned from Flight 227, the importance of paying attention to passenger concerns, the need for better pilot health monitoring, and the understanding that expertise can come from unexpected places, were slowly being integrated into new safety protocols. Emily's story had inspired change, but more importantly, it had reminded people of a simple truth: competence doesn't wear a uniform, and heroes come in all forms. As she prepared to board her next flight, this time as a pilot and instructor, Emily felt a quiet sense of satisfaction. The world around her was busy, chaotic even, but she had found a sense of peace. She had done her part, saved lives, and made a difference. And now, as the new generation of pilots began their own journey, she would be there, guiding them, teaching them the same lessons she had learned through years of service. Her journey wasn't about fame or recognition. It was about doing what needed to be done when the moment came. In the end, Emily Rhodess was not just a pilot or a hero. She was a quiet legend. Her story would live on, not because of the accolades or the interviews, but because of the impact she had on those around her, both in the cockpit and beyond it. And as she stood at the front of a new class of pilots, preparing to teach them about responsibility and perseverance, she knew one thing for certain: heroes don't need permission to act. They simply do what's necessary when it matters most. The end of the story wasn't marked by applause or grand gestures. It was marked by Emily walking quietly into the world once again, as she always had, ready for whatever came next.